The last thing we will cover in this lecture are different programming methodologies. There are two popular approaches for deciding how we're going to design our program. So one approach is what we call structured programming, and the other is called object-oriented programming. The idea with structured programming is we can divide our problem into smaller subproblems. Now, we've already talked about this before, where we can take a large complex problem and break it up into smaller subproblems. And this is what we call structured design. So what we do here is we take each subproblem and we would need to follow the same process as before. We would need to analyze each one. We would need to write an algorithm for each subproblem. We would need to write the code, test, debug, update as needed. And you may think that this is very tedious, but it is absolutely necessary. Because once we get the solutions for all of our subproblems, we can then combine those solutions, and that would give us the solution for the overall problem. So the whole process of implementing a structured design is what we call structured programming. And there are several different terms for the same thing. So this is also known as top-down design, bottom-up design, stepwise refinement, and modular programming. Now, object-oriented programming is a very different approach. This is actually a very widely used approach, especially with modern programming. So the first thing we need to do with object-oriented programming is identify the components of our program. And we call these components objects. And then we need to figure out how do these objects interact with each other. And you might think this doesn't make too much sense. I will forewarn you that this is a little bit of a learning curve, but once you get the idea of it, it's actually a very simple approach. So let's take a look at an example. So let's say we are writing a program for a red box machine or a video rental machine. So the first thing we need to ask are, well, what are the objects here? Well, we would have a video, that would be an object, and we would have a customer. And so once we have these objects, we need to think about what are some of the data that's associated with this. So what are some things that are associated with the video? Well, you got the name of the video, you have the actors for the video, the producer, the number of copies, and any additional information. So maybe the year, or maybe what it's rated. So I mean, there's all sorts of information we can have with it, but the point is each of these objects would have data associated with it. So once we have that set up, we need to think about what are the possible operations we can do, or how does the customer interact with the Redbox machine? How does the Redbox machine interact with the video? So there's several different operations we can perform. I mean, we can check to see if a particular movie is available in the Redbox, and if we do rent one of these videos, we can then reduce the number of copies that a Redbox has for that video. We can then increment the number of copies if we return a movie to the Redbox. I mean, there's all sorts of things we can do with it. So the whole point of object-oriented programming is that each object would have its own set of data and its own set of operations, and we can combine those information. We can combine all that data, we can combine all those operations into a single unit. So in Java, we would call these units classes. So now you see what we were saying earlier about the whole class thing. And so the idea is we have a Java class, and it would have our data and have our operations that we can do for a particular object of that class. And trust me, we will see plenty more examples of objects in Java. So what happens is we take all these objects together and put them into a final program. So I mean, a Java program is simply going to be a collection of objects that interact with each other. Now, for some of the earlier programs you're going to be doing, you're only going to have just a single class. But what you're going to do later on is have multiple classes where they would interact with each other. So a programming language that implements this object-oriented design, or OOD, is what we call an object-oriented language. And Java is one such language.